Hey everybody, Jen Hatmaker here, your host of the For the Love podcast. Welcome to the show. Well, we have some incredible guests today. We're in the middle of our series called For the Love of Queer Futures, and we've got a specific angle we're tackling today. We're looking critically at power, the ways in which it's accrued, the ways it affects people who are marginalized. We're asking the question today, what is our relationship to power? How do we analyze that? And then ultimately, how do we use what we have to help create a more equitable and just world for people, particularly as we'll get to it, but as this series relates in the LGBTQ plus community. It's a big subject. And so we needed some big brains to help us untangle it, and you're in luck. We have two guests today, both not only very talented writers and editors, but thoughtful activists who constantly use their voices to make change in the world. Well, first up, none other than Roxanne Gay. You know her. She's a writer, she's a professor, editor, cultural commentator. She really does it all. She's written some of your favorite books, huge New York Times bestsellers, Bad Feminist, of course, Difficult Women, New York Times bestselling book, Hunger. She is a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times. And then also just tra-la-la, she became a comic book author and she wrote The World of Wakanda for Marvel. Easy. Okay, sure. Additionally, I'm so delighted to have Dr. Megan Pillow, who's also on today. Meg holds a doctorate in English from the University of Kentucky. She is a graduate of the University of Iowa Writers Workshop in Fiction. She does all the things, just like Roxanne, you guys. Like, this list could be so long. She writes fiction and nonfiction. She's published all over the internet. She's won tons of awards for her writing. She also edits. She teaches other writers. She curates spaces. She's currently Roxanne's project manager, and she co-edits The Audacity, which is Roxanne's newsletter. So the two of them together are just power. Like, their dynamic is so interesting and vibrant. And I mean, these are two brilliant academic minds who are also creative and tender toward justice and equality. It's like everything good about being a human person. This conversation was so good. In fact, we got to the end and then we just kept talking. So, I'm a longtime admirer. And so I'm so delighted to have on the show today the wonderful Roxanne Gay and Megan Pillow. I am delighted, really, truly, to welcome you both to the For the Love podcast. Thank you for being here. Listen up, everybody listening. This is a really good one to watch if you want to watch this particular episode over on YouTube so you could see these ladies. But for everybody who's just on audio, would you guys mind introducing yourselves so they can know who's who here, and just tell us maybe kind of the big stuff, the big rocks in the river about you. This is where I'm at, and these are the people that live in my home, and this is kind of my thing, and introduce yourself by way of that, and then we'll just dive into some really incredible conversations today.
Great. Sounds gret. Roxanne, you want to start?
Yeah, go ahead, Meg.
Okay. I am Megan Pillow. I go by Meg. What to know about me? I know this is in my bio information, but I have a PhD from University of Kentucky in English literature. My focal period was 1840 to 1940, and an MFA from University of Iowa. And I am very lucky to be Roxanne's project manager. I do a lot of things for her, but I also, as part of that, I'm co-editor of The Audacity, which is her newsletter. And as for my home, I'm coming from Louisville, Kentucky. And I am a single mom, and I have two young children who are with me half time. I have a very good co-parent. Thankfully, those kiddos are not here now, but they are
Yay.
they are 9 and 11, because otherwise they would be in here with us.
We'd know it if they
Um,
were there.
and we absolutely would. So no pets or anything, just me and the kids.
Yeah. Roxanne?
I'm Roxanne Gay. I'm a writer, editor, and I also teach at Rutgers University.
Yeah.
And I have written several books, including Bad
Mhm.
Feminist and
Mhm.
Hunger. And of course, now this power book that I
Yeah.
co-wrote with Meg. And I live in Los Angeles and New York.
Mm.
And I live with my wife and
Mhm.
our dog, who you will absolutely hear at some point.
Great. Super.
He's a bit of a barker when someone like walks by the house, looks at the
Yeah.
house, thinks about the house, etc.
Yeah.
And I'm in
Right.
LA
Sure.
today. And I also live with my beautiful wife, Debbie Millman, who's in Boston today.
Okay. How did you guys meet? How did this partnership come to be?
Meg and
Ah,
I,
Hmm.
Meg, I mean, how did we meet?
you have many stories like this, I'm sure, but I will remind you that I actually was teaching. I was still a grad student at University of Kentucky. I was
Hmm.
teaching a women's lit course, and I decided to build a syllabus around difficult women. And so what I did was I took
Mm.
her book, took the
Mm.
short stories, paired the short stories with different novels by women of color throughout the 20th century, and the whole
Mm.
purpose of the class was to look at what it meant to be a difficult woman, especially changing over periods of time. And I
Yeah.
thought, I'm doing this, syllabus. I'm going to teach this class. I'm just going to email her and just
Oh
see,
my gosh.
just see if
I mean, the
if she
worst
might have
thing is she just
time.
doesn't respond.
The worst thing is she doesn't respond or says no, right? And
Yes.
so I thought I would email her and just see if she would be able to answer some questions that my students might have for her. And she
Yeah.
emailed me back 24 hours later and said, "No, I'll Skype
Wow.
into your class." And she did. She Skyped into my class.
Wow.
My students by that point were
Roxanne.
starstruck by her
Oh,
and
of course.
like it's one of those things that they all talked about in their evaluation, how cool it was.
Yeah.
And she was wonderful with them, as she always is.
Yeah.
And then I just kind of stayed in touch. I followed her. She retweeted a few of my stories, and
Yeah.
I applied for several jobs with her and got rejected several times before.
I love it. I love it.
But I mean, she was very thoughtful and very
Mm.
and clearly still engaged with my work even in those
Yeah.
rejections. And when I had the chance to start working part-time with her, um, at the Audacity, I applied for that job and got that position and worked with her part-time for about a year before coming on full-time.
Right on. I mean, these are two incredible meetings of the minds here. This is
Absolutely.
you're just what you both bring to the table by way of experience and education and the love of the written word is
Mm.
really something special. It's writing can be, as we all know, so lonely, such a lonely endeavor, so
Yes.
isolating. It's sink or swim, and it feels like it's on you and you alone. And so, having a partner that you can trust and rely on and lean on and create together feels awesome.
Yes.
And we don't even have to look any further than your book, than do the work. I'd love to hear, first of all, kind of how that came to be and the vision for it. Because from first conversation to book on a shelf, there's a lot of iterations of any given project. Can you talk a little bit about the impetus here? What was the origin story of this book, and how did it begin to take early shape?
Well, it started because several years ago I wrote an introduction for a book about power for children
Mm,
with this British publisher that
mm,
is also doing the adult book. And then a couple years ago, they came back to me and said, "Hey, we would love for you to write a book for adults."
mm.
And I said, "Well, no, I don't have time."
Mhm.
And which was the truth.
I believe you. I
And
believe that you did not have
It's
time
true.
to write
I
the
did
book, and
not
yet
have the
here we
time,
are.
but they kept
Uh-huh,
strong arm I guess I have a hard time saying no to people,
uh-huh.
and so they kept pressuring me, and I'm weak.
Mhm.
So I eventually said yes.
So relatable.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And then I dragged my heels on it for
yeah.
a long time, and as I was looking at my workload, I was just like, trying to figure out how am I going to begin to manage all of this. And so that's when
Mm.
I decided to hire Meg full time because
Yeah.
she's brilliant. She's an incredible writer in her own right. Her
Yeah.
nonfiction is just wonderful, and I highly
Mhm.
recommend that you check it out. And so I knew that I could trust her to help me get some clarity on projects, do research. She does all
Yeah.
kinds of interesting things for me, and I'm really appreciative. And then I thought, well, if I'm going to get this book done, I need a co-writer. Who could I
Yeah.
work with? And Meg instantly came to mind.
Yeah.
And so I thought, well, yes. And so I asked her, hey, do you have could you outline an idea for what we could do for this?
Mm.
And
Clever.
she came up with this really great outline for how do we think about power? How does it
Mm.
manifest in our lives? How
Yeah.
do we feel powerful? How do we feel powerless?
Mm.
And especially now, I think a lot of us are questioning our relationship to power, particularly as
Yeah.
we see people around the world who are being subjected to
Certainly.
the power of others.
Yes.
And so the book slowly but surely took shape.
Mm. It's such a daunting topic, and broad and nuanced and complicated and complex, and it hits at so many relevant and important intersections.
Mhm.
How did you start to craft it into the places where you went, these are going to be our primary thesis. These are the topics that we really, really want to hit. What were you hoping ultimately that your reader was going to walk away with?
I have
Uh,
some thoughts about that. Would you like to start, Roxanne?
no, I
I'm
would love
glad
for
to.
you to start.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay. Well, it was a very daunting topic. First of
Yeah.
all, I was so excited to have the chance to work with Roxanne on this book. But one of the things I know, especially from my time in academia, anytime we talk about a large, very kind of ambiguous subject, something
Uh-huh.
like
Yes.
power,
Yeah.
you're going to be dealing with definitions all across the disciplines. Everybody's going to have their own idea.
That's right.
And so one of the things that we knew we had to do was we had to give people at least a little bit of a foundation of here is the definition that we're talking about. Here is kind of its origin story, and also here's how it developed over time. And what we focused on was not trying to give, background on power in every single discipline, but we
Sure.
specifically focused on looking at how social theorists and philosophers were defining power. So that
Okay.
was kind of my starting point.
Mhm.
And obviously we pulled from the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary, because that's a great. It's great to look at the origin of a word and look at its history to kind
Mhm.
of to get yourself grounded a little bit. So we started there, but then I just started doing a survey of social theorists,
Mm.
philosophers, and looking at, what, how have people been talking about power? How have they been
Yeah.
thinking about it over time? And how has it changed? That was the most difficult part of the book to write.
Mm.
But once we had that grounding, I also then thought, okay, if we're going to be talking about how power affects us individually and especially as people who are in bodies that inhabit all kinds of different identity categories.
That's right.
We also need to give people a some type of grounding point to think about, for example, power and race. We can't talk about these
Yeah.
abstractions. So I knew that we had to have some concrete examples to lead every single section so that
Mm.
people would have, again, not just the foundation of the definition, but some type of real life example to ground themselves in before we started talking about the abstractions again. So that was kind of the
Mm.
frame that I used
Mhm.
for the most part. And then I knew that we were going to ask questions and give people to, the opportunity to write different things in the text as they went along to kind of
Mm.
capture their own thoughts and feelings.
Mm.
But yeah, that was kind of the approach I first took when I was doing the outline.
So let me ask you a question. Let's go back to where you started there, which was having to sort of edit the billions of ideas about power and definition and language and wording and context and disciplines. So, for the sake of any good book, you focused, which definition did you land on? So for your project, when you said, all right, in this particular work, this is our definition of power,
Mhm.
and this is how it has changed to your original 2 questions that you were asking yourself.
certainly.
The thing is, as Meg said, this is such a daunting prospect. How do
Yes.
you talk about power? Because there is no single definition to answer your
Right.
question. And I don't know that we really settled on one. And
Mm.
instead, we try to think about power in relation to various aspects of our lives: power and
Okay.
community, power and gender, power and
Yeah.
race, power and class.
That's good.
And so we worked from that kind of a framework, and then again drew from people who are known for their thoughts on power and who have
Absolutely.
tried to define power in different ways. Um, and one of the things that I really appreciated about Meg's approach was looking at the sort of breadth of ways to think about power, but then to complicate that by recognizing that power doesn't affect all of us equally. And some people are more able to wield power, are given power, and others have power wielded against them. And there are
Yes.
all kinds of factors that contribute to the why of that. And so the book also really gets into that. So really, it's not even about defining power as much as it is defining power and its effects on the world and the current configuration of the world.
I'd like to add one thing to that because I think that is absolutely true. One of the things that that I used like some of Roxanne's writing as impetus for kind of structuring this, but instead of thinking about that singular definition of power, I thought about power on planes. And what I mean by that is, when I approached this book initially, I thought, okay, we have to think about power, both how it relates to the individual and then how it relates to the collective. And that's what the book tries to do in those ways that she just discussed. We're trying to look at, how do we figure out what our sources of power are? How do we feel more empowered? How do we become more self-aware and understand what power means in our daily lives? And then the next step is thinking about it more broadly and saying, how does power operate in the collective that we are part of? Maybe that collective is, a small community. Maybe it is a group that we're in. Maybe it's the nation at large. Maybe it's the world. But thinking about it on those two planes, once we had kind of a broad understanding of those definitions, and again, like I said, using what I think of as a lot of the really thoughtful work that Roxanne does when she's talking about power, both in explicit and more oblique ways. That was kind of the focus that helped me organize thoughts as I was working on my parts of the book.
I wonder if you can both um, break it down out of sort of theory and construct into an example. Could you talk about a place in the book, a chapter in the book, however, where you discuss this is what it might look like on an individual level, embodied, internalized, processed, and then its implications collectively on the community, in the community at large? I'd love to hear some of this play out like in a real world dynamic.
Um, that's a good question. So for example, the final section of the book is how can you empower others? And so how do you take all of these ideas that we've talked about, all of these theories, and how do you apply it to your actual life? Because the reality is that we do often talk about things in these highly academic terms,
Yeah.
but how do you actually apply it? How do you make theory into practice? And so we do try to break down some of the steps that you can take. And one of the key things is when you see an abuse of power, calling it out, identifying it and calling it out, because oftentimes power works because nobody questions it, nobody
Of course.
challenges it. And it can be overwhelming to challenge power, but there really is what I hope people will see as a call to action, even if it starts small. And make sure that you are thinking about the impact of the abuses of power, and that you're not only centering yourself, that you're centering others and thinking about, if this is how I'm affected, how are other people actually affected? And it might be confronting racism or
Yeah.
misogyny or homophobia when you see it, challenging the notion that whiteness is the default,
Mhm.
uh, in conversations with friends and family. Um, Looking at race as a social construct, like what does that actually mean?
Mhm.
Rethinking gender and power. And so, that's just a place to start.
Mm.
And we also encourage people to ask themselves questions about their relationships to power.
Yeah.
And another great idea, and this is Meg started with this idea, was really thinking about, instead of choosing to center things, what does choosing the margins mean? What does it mean to not feel like you have to reside in the center of power? Like what's going on the margins of our culture, and what is interesting there? What does it mean to share power? And hopefully people will really think about these questions and come up with answers that go beyond the obvious. And I found it useful to even think about these questions. So that's a good place to start.
I also think another good example is one that this was actually a section that Roxanne suggested that we add to the book. And I found it really fruitful, especially coming up on an election year when we were working on this draft to think about it. And that is thinking about voting. And so we talk very specifically about voting and about the fact that the call to vote, especially in presidential elections, comes very, very loudly. But one of the things that it often masks is that voting alone is not enough. And we talk about some of the reasons why. We talk about the ways in which the Voting Rights Act has been stripped. We talk about the effect that gerrymandering has on the voting system and why this tool that we so long have relied on to be a tool of giving people, individual people, power over government and giving us the ability to enact change, it is not the tool that it used to be. It doesn't mean that we don't use it anymore. But one of the things we try to reiterate is this is why it's less useful than it was. It is one tool we have in our arsenal, but we have this moral imperative to try to do more things than simply vote. We have to use voting as one tool, but we have to figure out other ways to be involved in our communities and to enact other forms of power and not just rely on voting as the singular tool that we use to try to enact change. And I really appreciated that suggestion and that addition and felt like it was particularly important to talk about this year.
Totally. I'm glad you included it, although that is depressing. It's
It
so
is.
It is depressing, but I do think it's important, especially in an election year, for us to
Yeah,
sit with that,
that's right.
because in
Because you're right.
in
Yeah,
activist circles, we do often say vote, but like the people that are making the
yeah,
current decisions that we're frustrated
totally.
about were voted into office.
Yep.
Correct.
And I say that about people of all political persuasions. It's not
Mhm,
just Republicans, though I do think
mhm,
that they're probably the far bigger problem right now.
mhm,
But the Democrats are kind of allowing it, and they're
mhm.
kind of rolling over,
Yeah.
and just not even like, I've never seen an administration like the Biden administration that refuses to talk about their successes.
Mm,
It's wild. They have
yeah,
actually accomplished quite a lot, but they have done some really incredible things.
yeah,
And they refuse to talk about that. Like win after win after win. And they're just like Apple TV. Let's not talk about the amazing stuff we're
yeah.
doing. It's
Mm,
beyond. So we hope that people will recognize that political participation is more than just voting. It has to be.
It has to be. It has to
what
be.
did you discover? And of course, some of this would have been empirical, your own personal experience, but as you were writing, as you were researching and kind of parsing out the places in which we experience any sort of power dynamic or lack thereof, be it gender or race or sexual orientation, whatever it is, government, local, community, what were some of the through lines that you either discovered or sort of exposed about power in general? Like, what are some of power's rules?
A great question. The primary thing that I took away from this project was that people who have power rarely share it.
Yes.
People
Totally.
who have power hoard it, and people who have power see the
Mm,
empowerment of others as diminishing their own power.
that's
They
right.
don't want it, they don't like it, and they do everything in their power, haha, to prevent it. And it, that's been borne out throughout history. It's incredibly disheartening. And also that you would, a lot of times, especially in feminist circles, I think we get a bit lazy and we're like, if women ran the world, everything would be perfect. However, we have seen time and again that when women get power, they act exactly the same as men.
Yes, they
And
do.
so we really
Yeah.
do need to
Yeah.
really think about new models of power and recognize that there is no supposed promised land in a world where we're all ingrained in the same ways about power. Like we really
Yeah.
have to change things on a fundamental level, or nothing
Mhm.
in the broad scheme of things is ever going to change.
I love that answer. And I also think I definitely agree with those lessons. One of the other rules or lessons that I feel like I learned from this project is that individuals often vacillate between feeling two ways about power. They either feel completely helpless in the face of power, or they feel like they have all the answers. And I've seen that in both like the way we engage on social media, the way that we engage in our individual lives, but also um I've also seen it in like organizing spaces where people walk into a room and they either project this feeling of we are doomed, or I have all the answers and I'm going to fix this. And I actually think that one of the big lessons of power is that we have to learn a bit more self-awareness. We have to understand where our sources of strength are, where our challenges are. We have to read. We have to read broadly and widely. We have a really big bibliography at the end, and that's just some of the books on power that are out there that you can use as a resource. Um, People also have to learn to listen to other people. I think we're really good at talking and not very good at listening when it comes to thinking about power. And so one of the things um, that I came away with was the way to really understand power is to think about yourself first and then think about other people. Figure out what
Mm.
work you have to do, what self-awareness you have to gain, what education you still need, what knowledge you need to seek out to be somebody who is not just approaching this from an individual perspective,
Mm.
but who is able then to work with other people.
Mm.
And that felt really helpful when thinking about so many of the things that we're facing right now. Helplessness and also this egotistical source of knowledge. Neither one of those things is going to get us where we need to go and enact the change that we need to see, especially in terms of breaking down those hierarchies.
And I think another takeaway that is connected to that is that we can't opt out of power structures. A lot of times
Yep.
people get really nihilistic, and we're even seeing that now this year, like, okay, I'm not going to vote, which is, I get why people are making that choice and feeling that way, but that's still a choice. That is still a use of power. You're not opting out of power. You're simply making a different choice about how to use your power. And so I think it's really important to recognize that there is no opting out of power. Um,
That's
there are
true.
choices that we make. And some of those choices are traditional, and some of them are far from traditional. And that's not a bad thing. It's just different. And it's still a use of power. And one of the things that working on this book really showed me is it felt like it really deepened my understanding of power, because we tend to be kind of simplistic about power, and I understand why. For most of us, we often do feel disempowered and like we have no real options, and we don't really have any power. And history reminds us that we are probably right in thinking that, but it is also more complicated than that.
What do you posit are some practices or steps that people can take to reframe their personal relationship to power, ultimately in order to be a part of important change?
Hmm. Well, I think it starts with understanding your relationship to power. As Meg said, it starts with us, and then it requires like a real level of self-reflection that
Yes.
sometimes can be uncomfortable. And so I also believe you have to make yourself comfortable. And I talk about this quite a lot in various aspects of my work, that you have to make yourself comfortable with discomfort.
Yes.
Sometimes the answers aren't easy. Sometimes the choices you have to make are uncomfortable, require sacrifice. Um, yeah.
I agree with that. And I'll reiterate a couple of the other things that I said too. Like, I do think that I think people believe that they know more than they do. Often, one of the things that my PhD program taught me was that I got a doctorate and I now know a whole lot about like this tiny, like 1% sliver of the pie. And it actually made me aware of how much I don't know. And so I think sometimes people are overconfident in the knowledge that they have. And one of the things that I think about is that listening and learning, recognizing that other people are going to come to this issue with a whole wealth of knowledge that you will not have, a whole wealth of experience that you don't have, and listening to them rather than just constantly talking over people is it's like it's a resource for you. Being able to be in community with people is a resource. And so I think that's a critical process that when we're really eager to enact change, we aren't always receptive to. And I would say I would say this is something that organizers probably run into, but more often it's the folks who are walking into a space and who want to enact change that first time. So I think that's important. I also think that speaking up when you see something that is egregious, when vulnerable people are in danger, really important, really, really important, a vital lesson. And that's part of learning to center others more than yourself, which I think we're good at. We're good at centering ourselves. We're kind of taught that from day one, right? Um, and like Roxanne said, that's building towards becoming a bit more self-aware. And I think those things are critical.
It is true that power will not willingly concede its position, but it is also true that power is not an inevitable status quo.
Mhm.
It is also true that speaking up matters, that
Yes.
voices from the margins can matter and do matter and have always mattered. And there is the possibility for change that requires that discomfort that you mentioned,
Mhm.
Roxanne. And I've seen that in my own life so many times. And even being willing to admit, I find myself at interesting intersections, like most people, and mine, because I've got whiteness as a power, but I also am a woman. And so I've got these different categories. And so it has taken adult interior work for me to say, oh, I notice that sometimes I'm less apt to speak against power when it threatens one of the categories in which I
Yeah.
enjoy privilege. Even ancillary, even if it's still I'm just getting crumbs from the table. Those crumbs, I notice this instinct to want to preserve and to
Mhm.
protect, and do these weird workarounds, my integrity, to want to maintain access to some of those places of power. And this is some of that work that you're discussing that isn't soft and it isn't easy either. But it is effective. If people are willing to hold up a pretty decent mirror to their own psyche, to their own practices, to their own responses, I think we may be surprised what we see in there and what is possible. I'd love for a minute, if we could, here at the tail end, to narrow in at one of these particular intersections. This 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 series that you've joined me in, um, so grateful for it, is is about the possibility of queer futures specifically.
Mm.
And obviously there's a major power dynamic inside this conversation. And so I would like to hear you talk about your perspectives on where we are right now, where we're going in the fight for um, power, for the safety and representation and flourishing of queer futures. It's a very, very broad question, and I wish you well. I wish you good luck trying to answer that enormous thing I just lobbed up at you. Just pick wherever you want to start there, but I'd like to hear your thoughts.
One of the interesting things about the queer future is that few social movements have achieved as much change as quickly as the queer liberation movement.
Yes.
And in some ways that's sad because we're still facing quite a lot of oppression, but it's also exciting, and it's also sad because it shows how deeply ingrained things like racism and misogyny are, that this is the thing that is advancing more quickly than many other liberation movements. At the same time, I don't think it really is as productive as it's not productive to really belabor that, but I do think it's important to acknowledge it. But we're also seeing what happens when people who have been historically disempowered achieve some measure of power and are able to do something with that power, because we're seeing a real pushback right now.
Yes.
And for marriage equality is incredible. As someone who currently and for the rest of my life benefits from it because I am in a great marriage with a woman, it's very frustrating that we have to wonder if, for example, Donald Trump is elected again, which, wow, how could that happen? Does that mean that we're going to lose marriage equality? And there are members of the current Supreme Court that have indicated that they're willing to roll that back. They're willing to roll back um, uh, interracial marriage laws, which is funny. Clarence Thomas is in an interracial marriage. But it's just, we're seeing a lot of pushback. And so the queer future is complicated. I think the queer future is much better than the queer past. And we are really enjoying a lot of freedom, but it's not enough. And until all of us are free, none of us are free. I live in California and New York. It's very easy for me to say that because I live openly, I live safely. In New York, we live in a very gay neighborhood. And LA is just very queer in general. And so life is pretty good in terms of queerness, but I'm intimately aware that there are 48 other states, and in many of those states queer people are endangered, and the trans community in particular is vulnerable, and conservatives recognize that, and that's why they are using them as the sort of wedge to break apart queer progress and queer liberation. So for every success, there is a setback, and we're having to grapple now with how do we address these setbacks? How do we protect the most vulnerable among us? And how do we continue the project of queer liberation?
I appreciate that answer so much.
Yeah, me too.
So obviously Roxanne lives in New York and LA. I am a queer woman living in Kentucky.
Yeah, Kentucky's
Louisville,
different.
Kentucky's different.
Very.
Yep.
It's
That
very
is different,
different.
says the girl who lives here in Texas. Yikes.
Yes.
It's a
Yeah.
race
So
to the bottom. It is a
know
race
little
to the
bit.
bottom. We are doing our part.
Yes, absolutely. One of the things I will say is Louisville is historically a very queer-friendly city, partly
That's
because
true.
of U of L, the university here
Yeah,
has
that's true.
a really wonderful kind of community of queer folks.
It
So
is.
we do have we do have support systems here.
Mm.
But I agree with Roxanne that it's a very complicated future, in part because state to state, the experience, the lived experience of queer people is so very different.
That's right.
We had a huge push last year of anti-trans legislation here in Kentucky, like many other places in the South. It's really worrisome. It's really worrisome for my friends who are parents to trans kids about what their futures look like, about what their safety looks like in practice in a state like Kentucky. And yet at the same time, this is something I say over and over again on social media. We cannot just simply abandon our red states. We cannot just simply abandon the South. There are millions of people. The bulk of Black Americans in this country live in the South. And there are millions of trans people, Black folks, other people of color, queer people in general, disabled people.
Yeah.
This is a huge collection of people. And I really like what Roxanne said about the fact that our future is much better than the past, because there is this sense that folks are much more interested in community, joining together and pushing back against some of this legislation, not just at the state level, but at the federal level too. And I do think that danger is growing. I know there was a Supreme Court case last year that basically determined that states can pass bigotry laws, but national religious liberty laws are going to supersede. That's another thing that puts marriage equality in danger. And we've only had, like, Obergefell was in what, 2015? It hasn't been around that long. Anti-sodomy laws have only been outlawed in most places since like 2003. So we are still newly kind of into this queer future, but I do think that because of people's determination, people gaining more individual power in their lives, and also having more access to technology and collective structures that give people more of that capability to connect in ways that they couldn't before when they were isolated in places, that does give us a lot of hope for the future. But we are going to be pushing back against some um, very strong powers, the Supreme Court, as well as some of these politicians. Um, they have a stranglehold on a lot, and it's going to take a lot of work to resist that. So I feel cautiously optimistic, although realistic about the kind of battles that I think are ahead for all of us.
Yeah, and I will say I'm from Omaha, Nebraska, and until recently I've lived my whole life in rural and or Midwest places. And because my parents live in Florida and my brother lives in Houston, I spend a lot of time in Florida and Texas. And what's interesting, and I've always known this, but it's just interesting to see, queer people are absolutely everywhere.
Yes.
Absolutely
Yep.
everywhere. And
Of
especially,
course.
especially in Florida, which is why it's so interesting that Florida politically is the way it is, because I'm like, have y'all, like,
do you know you?
Florida?
Yeah. Do you guys know you?
Have you been
Plus,
to
queer
Miami?
kids are getting born all the time. So, yes.
It's really interesting. But what Meg says and what you say too, Jen, is so important. Like, we cannot forget literally 90% of the country, or 90, I'll say 85%.
Yep.
Yeah.
Because 10% of the country actually lives in California. But they're literally, the rest don't. And so, and then also the reality is that bigotry exists here too.
Yes.
Sure. Of
It
course.
seems like a paradise, but it's not. There are very conservative parts of the state.
Yeah.
And even in, LA and San Francisco, these cities, we have a lot of problems, and there's no paradise yet. And that's what we're working for, but we're not there.
So just to close the loop there and wrap this up, as we think, particularly this intersection, but this is we can take it and apply it. Think about the possibility of queer futures continuing to be liberated. What role does our individual power play here? Back to the idea of power. Where does this come in? At whatever it is we have, whatever is in our hand, whatever space we occupy, what does it look like to prioritize queer futures? Let's just bring it kind of local, individually with our power, and even just locally, collectively in our community, our communal power.
I think that one of the things I'll go back to is something that Roxanne mentioned before, which has become kind of a I don't know, it's become something that I rely on a lot when I evaluate decisions, evaluate how I feel about things. So much of what we do is focused on making our lives comfortable. That's understandable. It's understandable why we seek out that comfort. It makes life easier. But what is required for disrupting power, especially like things that are specifically very inequitable, it requires that discomfort. It also requires decisions that are unpopular. And we have to be more comfortable as people with sitting with that discomfort, with choosing discomfort and choosing things that are not popular if they have a kind of a long-term effect of redistributing power, disrupting some of those hierarchies. And I think that's hard for people. I think it's
It
hard
is.
to sit with that discomfort. So one of the things that I do now, I have this like this was something my therapist mentioned, but it was really helpful, which is rather than thinking about how can I, how can I reframe queer futures for myself and try to make sure that all queer people are safe. I use the approach where I choose one small thing a day. I choose
That's
one
good.
small thing a day, and it's sometimes focused on queer communities. It's sometimes focused on other vulnerable communities, both in
Sure.
the US or around the world. I choose one small thing a day. And then I also choose some big things to be involved in here and there. But
Mm,
for me, that I'm going to do one small thing
I
to
like
help
that.
more vulnerable people. I'm going to do one small thing. Maybe it's an education. Maybe I'm going to read a book today. Maybe I'm going to donate to a mutual aid fund. Maybe I am going to reach out to somebody who I know is going through a really hard time and try to help them. But that
I like it.
one small action a day has been really helpful because over time
Yeah.
that really builds up. So
That
that's one of
has
the
an
approaches that
accrued
I take.
effect, certainly, and a
It does.
contagious effect. I notice
Mhm.
that, I lead a large community of women, and I notice that type of um, lowered to the ground action
Mhm.
close in has a real contagious effect.
It
And
does.
that is the way that change is going to happen because, per your earlier point, the power brokers are not just going to open their hands and release it. There's just
No.
that has never happened and it will never happen. So these are the small little magic moments that do start to turn a tide. And they're not that sexy, but they do
No.
work. They do
Yeah,
work. Speaking of do work.
that's
Yep.
so important. Like a lot of times when we talk about social change, when we think about change, we're thinking about the big picture. And of course,
Yep.
that's
Sure.
important. We need to have a vision, we need to have a goal. But it's also kind of counterproductive because most of us look at where we are and where we're trying to be, and that distance is so vast that
Yeah.
it's just like,
Mhm.
well, let me just continue to live my life because what's the point?
Totally.
So like Meg, I have found that doing smaller things, doing local things
Yeah.
Yes.
helps so much. And
Me
so
too.
many of the issues that we're seeing in terms of like book banning and
Mhm.
Mm,
um, government overreach in terms of curricula, these are things that are
mhm.
happening at the local level, library
Right.
boards,
Mhm.
school boards, city councils. These are things that we can run for. We can absolutely win elections to get on our local library board.
Yeah.
Yes.
These are things we should do. We should participate. Mutual aid
Good.
funds are really incredible. The like people who do mutual aid are just there are saints among us, and I do not
Mhm.
say that lightly. Like they
Yeah.
just do it because it needs to be done.
Yep.
That's
They're
right.
not
Yep.
asking for anything except
Mm.
maybe come and volunteer, or if you have 15 extra dollars, contribute it. And so the unsexy stuff is actually where a lot of the work is getting
Yeah.
done. And
That's
also,
right.
I always encourage people to recognize you don't have to reinvent the wheel. So many people are
No.
like, I'm going to start a nonprofit.
No.
Excuse me, why?
Why?
There
As a
are,
leader of one, I'm like, "Run!"
yes, there are thousands of
Yes.
nonprofits. There are
Yes.
thousands. Whatever nonprofit you want to start, someone already has.
That's
Stop
right.
Yes.
trying to
That's right.
rebuild things that
That's
already
good.
exist. Like, go look and
That's good.
find what's doing that work and volunteer or get a job there, whatever. If,
That's great.
it just like so many people feel like they have to be pioneers and like,
Mm,
great, I love that energy. But a lot of the work has already started. A lot of
you're right.
organizations are already doing the kinds of work that you want to do. So just inform yourself and then
That's good.
ask where you can be most of use.
That's great, you
I
guys.
love that point too, just because I think oh, people always want to start something rather than join something. It does sound so much sexier.
Heroic. It's
But
so
Mhm.
but
heroic.
it does, but
Yes.
often those people have been at it for years. The folks who already
Of
have those
course.
established organizations, they are like a wealth of knowledge and information. They can
That's right.
teach you so much just by going in and saying, "What can I do to help?" Especially
That's
if you're
right.
asking to help with the stuff that isn't sexy, the stuff behind the
Mhm.
scenes.
Yeah.
You are going to learn a tremendous amount. You're also going to engender their trust if you do that. And I think that that is really important. And I like the
Mm,
focus on the local too, because I
me
think we're
too.
seeing evidence of that now. So many of the big organizations, that the national organizations, their money is going places that we are not particularly happy about.
That's
They're
right.
also funding like some of these salaries, of of the execs are ridiculous. Some of the money, the sources of the, you know, where they're getting money from is questionable. And the local organizations, you can actually see that money on the ground. You can see the difference more quickly, and you're not funding, you know, a bunch of things that may not align with your values, which I think is really important. And you can see the change, like you can see the change more quickly.
Absolutely.
So,
You know, Meg makes an incredibly important point. A lot of times people give their money to the most obvious organizations.
yes.
I don't want to say their name because I work with them all the time, but there's like, you know, a really huge national organization that does work on behalf of women, and they don't need any more money.
No, they do
They
not.
have
That's
more
right.
than enough.
They do not.
Yeah.
Truly, truly, they don't need money.
Yeah.
And so, you know, go local, look at what's happening in your community, or, for, you know, look at what's happening in Mississippi and
Yes.
Louisiana, which has a very special governor right now.
Very
See like
special.
what's going on the ground there, because some of these national organizations have more money than they can possibly spend.
You're right.
And they're going to always continue to raise funds because that's the model right now for big nonprofits. That's just what they do. They have entire staffs dedicated to raising money, and they were never going to stop. And that's, you know, I don't judge it because the fight is never going to stop. But your money is going to go much further with smaller organizations.
That's great.
And a lot of those organizations are really getting hit hard right now. Because of the rising costs, food costs and everything else. They are not seeing the same donations they have in the past.
That's
they
so
really,
real.
really need our support.
You could not, you're just taking words out of my mouth, Meg. I know. You guys, so good. Can you tell everybody quickly just where to find you, where to follow you, where to get your book, but particularly your latest book? And obviously just where to send people to hear more, to learn more, to understand more.
Well, this book is available on June 20th, wherever
Yeah.
you like to buy books. And if your local independent bookstore doesn't have it,
Yeah.
do just ask them to order it and they will. But bookshop.org will also have it.
Yeah.
Of course, the mothership will have it.
Of course. Of course.
And I'm on Instagram at Roxanne Gay 74, and I'm on Blue Sky. But other than that, I'm not really on social media.
That sounds
anymore.
nice.
It's very nice.
So nice.
It was the best decision I've ever made.
I reiterate everything that she says about the book. I would also encourage you, if any of your listeners are interested, to subscribe to the Audacity. We talk about so much there. We have a great emerging writers series and a great book club. Like it's becoming a real community and we love it. I also have a small newsletter called Craft Work, where I talk about craft things here and there. That's on Substack as well. And the Audacity is Substack also. And I'm one of the holdouts on Twitter. I will never call it that other name. At Meg Pillow. I don't know how long I will last, but I'm trying to hold out there because it's still a good information source for me. And then on Instagram at Meg Pillow 77.
Right on. You guys, we're going to round all those up for you in one place. So you will not have to track those down. Absolute final question. I ask all my guests this in every series, and you can, I would love for you to answer this however you feel like. So if you are feeling earnest and precious today, it could be that kind of answer. And otherwise it could be absurd. And I love it all. So I actually borrowed this question from a priest that I love. Her name is Barbara Brown Taylor. And she asks people, what is saving your life right now? You want to go first, Roxanne?
You know, I would say my wife and puppy. And I mean that in the cheesiest way possible.
I believe you.
You know, it's not that someone else can save you, but at the same time, to know that you have a soft place to land every day while doing work that, you know, it's not coal mining, but when you have opinions and you are a Black woman, you're a Black woman, you know, people don't take to it that well most of the time.
They have thoughts. They have thoughts.
They do. I'm sure you know this well. And so, you know, to have these two creatures, well, one person, one adorable dog
Mm.
that are always excited to see you and like always want to hang out is just very awesome. And that
Yes.
is helping me deal with just, my mom is sick and
Yeah.
Mhm.
life is life. So
Yeah.
it's just great to have an amazing support system. And the
Lovely.
is super cute.
Lovely. I love it. How about you, Meg?
My answer is similar. I always say my people and my work. My kids are always such a breath of fresh air. They are amazing and infuriating and wonderful, and
Yeah.
I mean everything that kids are. But they also take me out of the moments where I might kind of trend towards despair.
Mm.
I also have a great mom and stepdad who are supportive, and some wonderful friends. A long distance person that I'm dating who's wonderful, and it's nice to have
Nice.
people that you're aligned with, whether
It
they're
is. It's
in
everything.
person, or not. But and then my work, like the work that I do for Roxanne, is always so engaging. My own writing is always just really something I go back to when I don't know what else to do. So those are the things
Yeah.
that kind of keep me going.
I love it. We love to see it. I'm in a long distance relationship too. It's a whole thing, isn't it?
It is. It is.
Hmm.
My person is
Hmm.
in DC, and it is not always easy.
Yeah, yeah. My
But
person's in Nashville, and I'm like,
My
it's so
wife and I started
far.
long distance. It's
You did?
we did. I lived in LA and she lived in New York, and that's why we're
Oh,
bi-coastal now. We're gonna
yeah,
eventually end up in LA full time, but
yeah.
now we go back and forth together unless we're
I love
traveling.
that.
And long distance, it takes work. I was very
Yes.
grateful that when I was in a long distance relationship, I was finally at a place in my life where I could afford it.
That's what we say. I'm like, what would we do? I would just have to be like, you know what? We just don't have a shot here.
'Cause I remember when
Like,
I would try it when I was younger, and it
yeah,
would be like, maybe I'll see you this year, maybe I won't. Like, I remember
totally.
saving for a $300 plane ticket
Of
when I was
course.
22, and when this time around, it was so much easier, and I was so
Yeah,
grateful for it. That was like one of the many things I did not take for granted because it
Mhm.
100% same.
just helps.
I am flying to Nashville in 4 hours.
That's
Oh,
So
what a good
great.
flight.
That's
thank goodness we can
wonderful.
afford plane tickets, I guess.
Mhm.
Like in the meantime, damn. Also, finding love at this age is crazy. So who
Yes.
knew? Who
Yes.
Yeah,
knew?
I found my wife found me, to be honest, but
Ah, uh-huh.
in my 40s, and
Yeah.
I was 44 and she was 57 when we met, and
Oh, yeah.
it was just like, wow, there you are.
Uh-huh.
Okay,
There you are.
excellent, let's
Yeah.
do it.
Mhm.
Yeah, exactly. All right, you guys. Hey, thanks for coming on the show. I was just really looking forward to this conversation and meeting you both. I respect you. I admire you. I've learned from you. So for me, this is just a real important moment to get to meet you face to face. And so I'm excited for my community to read your new book. I think it's important. I think it's timely. And thank you for your labor to put it out into the world. You swim in deep waters, which has a cost, and I know that. And so thank you for choosing it. And I'm glad you have soft places to land in the meantime where you can recuperate and recover and renew so you can keep your hand at this like really powerful work that you both do. Thanks for being here.
You.
Thank you so much.
You guys, as mentioned, they've got a bunch of cool stuff that you can have access to. Their newsletters, their spaces, their socials, obviously their canon of books that they've written. And so to make this easy for you, go over to jenhatmaker.com under the podcast tab. We'll put it all in one spot. This episode, the show notes, links to everything they mentioned. Um, all the podcast stuff is over there, should you have ever missed it. And speaking of, if you miss a show, just subscribe and you never will again. Wherever you get your podcast, you can go to the podcast app on your iPhone and just search in the search bar for the love and then tap the plus sign and you are subscribed. That's essentially what you do wherever you listen, Spotify or Stitcher, whatever. Just search it up and hit add and you'll never miss an episode. And I don't want you to miss any because we have so many exciting things coming up shortly for the show. Big things. Um, big things we've been working on for quite some time. It's too soon to talk about it, but it's not that far away, and I think you're gonna love it, and I just can't not wait. So don't miss any. That's my point. Anyway, big thanks to Meg and Roxanne today. What a great conversation. More to come in this incredible series on powerful queer futures and incredible guests as always. And I know you're going to love it. Thanks for being here, you guys. See you next week.